City Council for Monday, August 27th, 2018. We have some presentations and staff reports tonight. Our first presentation is an overview of the statewide opioid class action lawsuit. Mr. City Manager.
Madam Mayor, members of the City Council, I think you're all pretty well aware of the what's been labeled as an epidemic in our country regarding prescription drugs and specifically opioids across the country. Here in the state of Missouri, there are several pending lawsuits against some of the larger manufacturers of those. One firm that has come forward is represented by Mr. Jack Garvey, who has signed up about a dozen municipalities across the state and came this evening to speak with us about that. So at this time, I would welcome Mr. Garvey to the podium and let him make his presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name's Jack Garvey. I'm an attorney from St. Louis. Up until about 3 years ago, I was a circuit court judge in the city of St. Louis, a trial judge for about 18 years. During that time, I was the chief judge of the juvenile division. I was the chief criminal judge, and also I was the judge who designed and then was the administrator of what we call the mass tort docket in the city of St. Louis. Not a class action docket, but a mass tort docket. I'm here tonight to talk to you about a state court theory or a state court idea in holding accountable the manufacturers, distributors, pharmacies, and prescription benefit managers involved in the opioid crisis. And before I get to that, I'd like to talk about a couple of things: the two levels of liability, the narrative or the history of the problem and how we got here today, and then the damages of your city here of Independence. This story all started with Purdue Pharmaceutical, which was owned by three brothers. The oldest brother was a brother named Arthur Sackler, who was a psychiatrist, but he was also a marketing genius. Arthur Sackler saw that in order for opioids to make money, a Schedule II narcotic, the market to hit was the chronic pain market. At that time, Purdue had a drug called M-Contin that was a regular opioid painkiller lasting 4 hours. The patent was running on that drug. Purdue needed to develop a new drug, so they came up with a 12-hour pain relief pill called OxyContin, which they claimed lasted 12 hours. It didn't. Their studies showed that it lasted about 6 to 8 hours. What then Purdue then did was put on the label that the drug was meant for post-surgical pain, cancer pain. All opioids are meant for that. That is on the label. But what Purdue did was then hire a sales staff of 1,200 and aggressively marketed the drug toward general practitioner doctors beginning from around 1998 to about 2007. They also used doctors that were on their payroll, that were not revealed to the public as being on their payroll, who wrote bogus articles claiming the good effects and the non-dangerous qualities of opioids, such as opioids were not addictive, there was no withdrawal symptoms, you could function as a normal human being. If you rose the dosage, you would not die or be more addicted. Those 4 lies that I just told you are just that, they're lies, but the company knew that. 2007, they got caught, were indicted, pled guilty, paid a fine of $600 million. You would think the story would be over then, but it wasn't. Purdue then got with other companies, Teva Pharmaceutical, Johnson & Johnson, other manufacturers of opioids, fentanyl, and made the same claims. This time they created bogus front groups, which they all funded, and put out to the idea the same marketing traps that I just listed for you, and sold them as gospel and sold them as real medicine. The target again was the chronic pain market, general practitioner doctors. The opioid prescription rate went up, also the death rate, also the use of heroin. 4 out of 5 users of opioids will move on to heroin and fentanyl. So that's the first level of liability. The second level of liability is against the distributors and the pharmacies and the prescription benefit managers. Under the laws of the state of Missouri and the federal government, all of those have a duty to report any suspicious orders. A suspicious order is in an inordinate amount of a Schedule II narcotic going to a specific geographic area. None of these companies picked up the phone and fulfilled their duty by calling the DEA or the state pharmaceutical board. They have also pled guilty. McKesson, Cardinal, St. Louis's own Mallinckrodt Pharmaceutical paid a $35 million fine about this time last year. That's the second level of liability, because the liability there is they have so flooded the markets and continue to do so that they have created what is called the diversionary market, where opioids then flow out into the street, become part of the illegal market, and then go at a lower price where more people become addicted and eventually swing over to heroin. That is the second level of liability against the next group of defendants. So what does this all mean? What this means is cities like yours, counties that we represent, have paid a cost for all this. It is you guys, as a municipality, that is paying for this. I know the families and individuals are paying with their life and treatment care and expenses, but it is you that is paying law enforcement, jail space, health costs, Narcan costs, health, treatment in the jails, education, and overall treatment. You have spent this money in the past 10 years, and under our theory also, we have a nuisance theory that we believe that you're going to be paying this for the next 5 to 10 years. The defendants have created a whole new generation of addicts, which you're going to be responsible for. That is the case in a nutshell. We represent 10 counties in one city. We represent the counties of Jefferson County, Cape Girardeau, Iron, Crawford, Washington, Greene County, Christian County, Stone, Taney, Jasper, and the city of Joplin. We filed a lawsuit 3 weeks ago in the city of St. Louis in state court, and that's where we wish to keep the lawsuit and not have it transferred to the federal, what they call the multi-district litigation in Cleveland. We would like to keep Missouri counties here in Missouri State Court. That is our theory, and that is what I'm here to talk to you tonight about.
Thank you, Mr. Garvey. Appreciate you being here. Other comments or questions from the council? Yes.
Everyone awake?
What do you want from us?
Well, I know it's a study group, but normally what happens here is I have a resolution and then an authority to represent. We have been retained by these counties on a contingency fee basis. It would be a 25% contingent fee. The City of Independence would not pay any cost. We anticipate this lawsuit costing between $3 and $5 million. Our law firm will front that amount, will pay that amount. We will not ask for any upfront costs. We will be reimbursed those costs in the event that there is a settlement or a verdict in this case. But for all the counties and all the cities, there are no costs to that. That's what our service we're providing.
Any other comments? Yes.
So no providers are included in this, and no pharmacies?
Pharmacies, yes. We have sued Walgreens and CVS. Doctors, no. It's our contention that the doctors were misled, that they were lied to, that the public was misled. So no, we do not plan. We have bought in one pain mill in the city of St. Louis. That is one defendant's a doctor that is way over the top, and every place has a place like this. We have bought a doctor like that in, but not the overall doctors, no.
Can we ask our attorney for an opinion?
Most cities who are interested in the opioid litigation put out a request for proposals from the various law firms who are providing this service. Compare and contrast the different offerings they have, both in terms of the litigation and the assistance and development of the costs that the city has incurred that could be recoverable. So my recommendation would be that you put out a request for proposal for legal services if you are in fact interested in pursuing this litigation.
Is there also a state lawsuit?
The Attorney General has a lawsuit going, which makes critical the question, what costs are recoverable back to the city?
The Attorney General has filed his lawsuit in the city of St. Louis also. He has sued a limited amount of defendants, a smaller number than we have. Okay. I think he is stuck essentially to the manufacturers.
Okay, thank you. Mr. City Manager, is there any other direction that you need from the council tonight? We appreciate the presentation, and obviously this is something of great concern to our community.
I think I can work with our legal department and begin exploring next steps and then bring back a more formal recommendation to the council thereafter. I think, Mr. Garvey, for example, mentioned this resolution. We'll take a look at that and sort this out and make sure we walk this forward in the most responsible way possible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
We
you.
have been involved in RFPs, several of them, so.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for being here.
Thank you.
Our next presentation is the Energy Master Plan presentation. Mr. Sabian.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I think a major initiative we've been working on for nearly a year now involves this Energy Master Plan, which looks at how our costs are being, or our power is being supplied to the city and the costs associated with that. So last November, you directed us to engage in this process. We've retained Burns & McDonnell to engage in this study for us. Tonight, they are here to present the findings of their analysis and begin to formulate some next steps in this area. So without further ado, I think I'll first welcome our Assistant City Manager and Director of Public Utilities, Mark Randall, to provide a little bit more overview, and then he'll bring up our consultant thereafter.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark Randall, Assistant City Manager, and it's great to be here. A year ago, you recall the city received the results of a management audit from Management Partners, who did a management audit of Independence Power and Light for the city. One of the key recommendations of that report was for the city to follow through with a process that you'd already begun, which was with an RFP about the month before, which was an RFP for an energy master plan. The need for such a plan, as you recall, sprang from a realization that the Blue Valley plant was nearing the end of its useful life. And you also had a suspicion that capacity alternatives might provide significant savings to our customers. So last November, the council voted to award a contract to Burns & McDonnell for an energy master plan study. The resolution that you passed stated that the scope of the project was to assess the condition of on-site generators, evaluate viable alternatives, conduct simulation modeling on alternatives, and evaluate the cost and availability of purchasing capacity and energy to replace some or all of our on-site sources of generation. So tonight we will hear a presentation from Mr. Mike Borgstad. He's the Manager of Utility Consulting for Burns & McDonnell, who conducted this report, and he's going to walk us through this report tonight. So at this time, I'd like to ask Mike to come up to the podium to address the mayor and council.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening.
Evening.
Thank you, I guess, for having the opportunity to help you guys out with this very important study as we walk through it. It's, Mark indicated, it's been several months in the making, so we are finally come to completion, and happy to present these results with you. I believe you guys got a copy of this in front of you, so it's pretty lengthy. It was a very exhaustive effort, so I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible, but I don't want to skip over anything, and make sure you guys get all the information that you want. So feel free to ask me questions as we go through, and hopefully I got my bottle of water here ready to go as I get a little wordy. So a master plan is something a lot of utilities do. And let me see if that's flipping forward. So I have an agenda here. I'm going to go through several of the issues. One thing I want to do is just let you guys know what an energy master plan is, or an integrated resource plan, and then kind of talk to all the different pieces of that and open it up to questions. So what is an energy master plan? Well, the investor-owned utilities are typically governed by the public service commissions. They're required to do these every 2 to 3 years as part of the state statutes of being a regulated municipal or regulated utility. The municipal utilities and cooperatives are typically self-governed by city councils, so you guys decide when you do these. Really what an energy master plan is looking to do is doing an economic evaluation of how do you provide capacity and energy, and I'll get into the kind of those terms, but how do you provide energy to your customers under a bunch of various cost issues, environmental issues. You want to make it safe, you want to make it reliable. And the focus is on planning for the next 20 or 30 years, but making short-term decisions. You're only making decisions right now in the short term. You're not looking to make a decision 20 years down the road. but you want to make sure that you can position yourself with decisions today that are going to make your utility successful for your customers in your city. So when you're putting together a master plan, one, there's a ton of data gathering that is required to go through these. So one of those was assess the condition of your existing resources, both the Blue Valley facility and all the combustion turbines across the town. Then you have to take a look at what are other options available, whether that's new resources, or you can purchase capacity energy, and then what other issues are there, such as reliability issues, and you gather all that data. And then what you're doing is take a look at doing the cost-benefit evaluation. It's very sophisticated, specifically to energy and capacity, but just like any type of evaluation you're taking a look at, you want to weigh the cost and the benefits associated with each of those. So you go through some economic screening, you optimize that portfolio, and at the end of the day, you want to come up with results of a master plan. And so if you have heard in the news, IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, Energy Master Plan, all synonymous. So what are the major highlights? Kind of cutting to the chase, and we'll get into more details on this, but within the electric utility space, we've seen a lot of the older steam units have become higher cost, and they're not as efficient as what they used to be. Newer technologies have replaced that. That is very similar. You're facing that with the Blue Valley facility right now. There are less expensive options out there for providing power. The combustion turbines are also aging, and they're going to require some capital spend. However, those resources still provide a great deal of value to the utility in the form of capacity. And as I said, I'll get into that a little bit more, but it allows you to use energy from the SPP market, which is the regional trading market that the utility operates in. What we did was we conducted a benchmark assessment, and the fixed costs for power, the fixed costs for power production are above the IPL, above the industry average for IPL. So the IPL has done a good job of looking at ways to reduce those costs over the course of the study. Continued efforts are going to need to be made as the utility changes. And then the existing portfolio really has sufficient energy requirements. What is going to be needed with retirement of units is capacity. And as I said, those are two terms that are very specific to the energy industry. So I wanted to give a little bit of a highlight of some of the industry overview and trends. Over the past 5 to 8 years, you've seen a lot of coal-fired power plants, and that's for a variety of reasons: environmental concerns, cost concerns. Natural gas prices are much, much lower than they have historically been, and they're expected to remain low with natural gas fracking. Relatively low load growth. People are becoming more efficient air conditioners, more efficient light bulbs. Just cognizant of turning the lights off more as that awareness has come out. Increasing amounts of renewable energy, both distributed on the system and also throughout the grid with large wind turbines out in Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas. Solar panels here, locally in Missouri, but certainly in the Southwest, in Phoenix and California. And so all of that has led to depressed wholesale electric prices. And one of the things that's done is retired a lot of coal plants, and it's made the electric utility industry much more dependent on natural gas-fired resources. Well, as you might imagine, a coal-fired power plant has a large coal pile sitting there. You get train deliveries, the fuel's on the ground. Natural gas has a lot of other uses, such as heating our homes and our buildings, and it's just-in-time delivery on pipelines. So with more reliance on natural gas in the power industry during winter months, there's been this firm fuel concern within the industry, so that's a recent trend. And mainly we have the polar vortex that happened a few years ago. This last year we had the bomb cyclone in the Northeast that has the industry in, looking at that. So, now taking a look at IPL overview and kind of trends specific to you guys. Overall, your guys' load has decreased over historical times, so you're very similar to the industry in that regard. You have reduced your reliance on coal-fired power, one, converting the Blue Valley unit to natural gas, and also the retirement of the Missouri City. One other important factor is in March of 2014, the SPP Integrated Marketplace started, which essentially gave utilities an easy way to trade power with your neighbors, essentially. So it allows you to Yeah, go ahead.
Just had a question. You're saying that we have lowered our load compared to historical amounts. So is it possible for us to lower our required capacity? We have a certain capacity based on the last year, last several years. Is it possible to lower that capacity since we're running way below where the load has been the past several years?
Yeah, so there is a way to lower your capacity, which would be through the retirement of units or termination of contracts, essentially, is what you.
No, I'm talking about required capacity.
Oh, so
Because
you're-
right now, if we retire units, we're required to buy more capacity. Can we lower our required capacity?
Yes, so you can do demand-side management programs, which help reduce the overall consumption from your customers. So there are programs available that a utility can do. You guys are doing a number of those already. There's some other ones that other utilities might do, but again, it's a cost-benefit evaluation. So there are ways for utilities to incentivize customers to reduce their demand.
Well, I was talking about the required capacity by the Southwest Power Pool. They require us to have a capacity, what, 12 or 15%?
Mr.
Above.
City Manager, maybe,
12% above the maximum that we use. Is it possible for us to lower that required capacity?
So the SPP sets
Yes.
the required reserves that you have to hold. So you cannot change that. The only thing that you can change is incentivizing your customers to use less through certain mechanisms.
My understanding was that we can petition and ask Southwest Power Pool to lower our required capacity, especially if we're using less over several years.
So if you're using,
Right, I think our load forecast is the answer he's looking for. Taking a good hard look.
Okay.
at the forecast to be
Mr.
close.
City
Is
Manager.
this your city, is this, thank you.
would you, I think this is really a question for our
Okay,
utilities director to answer. I think we're
Okay.
giving you a question that you maybe not be quite know the answer for.
Okay.
So, I don't know, Mark, if you know the answer to this, or if you can shed some light on this. I understand what the councilman is asking.
Yeah, I think they're trying to ask whether since we have to have 12% above what the highest peak was for our capacity that's what you're
Yes.
getting at, and whether the total usage has dropped enough that our target that we have to have the 300 and whatever, 80 megawatts of capacity we have to have, whether that has dropped because of lower usage. And I think the answer that you have to that is no at this time.
yeah. And there's some slides. Hold that question till later, because
Okay.
I got some slides I think
Okay.
that'll illustrate that a little bit better.
okay.
So just highlighting a few more things about the Southwest Power Pool. It's a regional, multi-state area. Here you can see it geographically in the Midwest. And you can see some of the statistics there of how many megawatts and the resources and wind resources that they're used. So you guys are a participant of the SPP, which is great because it allows you to use the energy that all of your neighbors are and combine that. So one of the interesting things here is the chart shown here shows the total capacity within SPP. A big chunk of that is gas resources as well, which would be highlighted by the yellow in the pie chart. The light blue would be coal resources, and the dark blue is wind. Now, one thing that wind does is it doesn't give you capacity credit, and I'll get into this a little bit later. However, it gives you a great form of energy. And so if we take a look at now flipping this pie chart into energy, not just capacity, but energy, you can see the lion's share still comes from coal units. Those are typically still very cost competitive when it comes to providing energy. Gas is certainly providing a good share, but in SPP, with the number of wind farms that have been installed in Kansas, Oklahoma, and parts of Texas, you can see that wind is. So the point of this slide is, as a member of SPP, your energy is very, very diversified because you're buying from this pie chart of energy through your participation in SPP. So kind of hitting on the trends, pre-2009 when we're doing planning for utilities, gas prices were much, much higher, and you saw wholesale energy prices were averaging about $46 per megawatt hour. So that's at the wholesale level, not at the retail level, at the wholesale level. 2009, we had a lot of issues happen. We had the recession after the real estate market issues. We had natural gas fracking become much, much more prevalent and really come into the United States. Energy efficiency, people continue to consume less, and increased renewables is increased competition. So with all of that competition, we have seen market prices since 2009, post-2009, dramatically lower cost and around $27 per megawatt hour in the average. One of the things that you want to take is look at short-term disruptions. We try to make sure that we position the utility to be able to handle that. So the polar vortex was about in 2014. It was very, very cold during that time. You can see even with natural gas peaking very, very shortly, we only saw a little bit of a spike in energy market prices. So these are things that are anomalies, but we want to be able to position the utility to be able to accommodate those when we're taking a look at a master plan. So I think this might get to a little bit more of your question on load as we get into what the utility requirements are. So historically, the pillars of the utility mission statement, which is always good to kind of take a look at, is one, you want to provide low-cost energy as much as possible. You want to provide it reliably. People want their lights to come on. You want to have safe energy for the community and the workforce. And it needs to be environmentally compliant. So when you're putting together an energy master plan, you're trying to put together, there's minimum requirements on each of these, but there's also the opportunity to go above and beyond on some of those if the community is willing to or the utility is willing to do that. Getting in a little bit to what is IPL's obligation as a utility or a member of SPP. So one is to provide sufficient capacity to meet that peak demand. So SPP sets that capacity requirement. So you will have to provide 12% above what your load is. However, if your load decreases, then the amount of capacity that you need to hold can decrease with that. However, the percentage that you have to have is 12%, and that's set by SPP. You can meet capacity requirements through a number of different ways. So you can either build units and own those, similar to Blue Valley, similar to the combustion turbines. You can buy contracts through bilateral contracts where you agree with your neighbor utilities that, hey, I'm going to buy some capacity from you for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. There's other demand-side management programs, like we mentioned, where you can incentivize your customers to reduce their capacity as well. The flip side of that coin is energy, the energy side. So if you look at, I'm a mechanical engineer by education, so I need to be able to see something as opposed to electrons, because you can't really see those. But capacity would be the size of the pipe you need to have for your peak flow. When you take a look at energy, that's the amount of water running through that pipe at any one time. So that's the energy component. So a lot of times you're not running at peak capacity. That peak capacity only happens at one time a year. So again, energy can come through units that you build, bilateral contracts, or the SPP market. And there's also conservation measures that you can do to incentivize lower energy needs. Energy must be compliant with regulations, so you have to be compliant with all the environmental regulations out there. And then there's also other mandates that may be out there, solar or renewable mandates. Right now, I know IPL is voluntarily meeting the Missouri standards for renewables, and so what we decided to do was continue that level of obligation by meeting the renewable energy through mainly wind and some solar.
Can I stop you there just for a moment?
Sure.
I don't know if you, Councilman, I don't know if your question was completely answered that you asked, because I didn't hear it answered. So the question on the floor is, if SPP sets the capacity requirements, do we have the capability to appeal to them, depending on what our outcome of decision is in the future, to ask for a lesser requirement? Is that something that we can do in the future? Was that the point of your question?
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
so I'll,
Mr. City Manager.
Yeah, I know that got a little confusing there. I think we were talking about a couple of different things, but this SPP does that 12% that we're talking about here, but that number that IPL's obligation is, that is flexible, and we actually had that drop slightly a little bit this year. The overall objective for us would be to get that number as trued up as possible because of the estimates. We want that to be as accurate as possible so that you're not paying for this excess capacity that you don't need. We still have to hit this 12%, but 12% of what's what we're trying to aim for.
So, Mr. City Manager, does that just ebb and flow, or do we have to request that and they have to set it, or does it just float with the load?
It's my understanding, and I'm oversimplifying, but it's a give and take conversation that, we have to demonstrate our capacity, but yeah, it's a calculation of what is the, highest usage they have with the excess amount on top of that then that you have to demonstrate. And I mean, it's incumbent on us to prove what that number is, but of course they've got experts that are analyzing that as well too.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add one more thing? So just to add to the conversation, it's obvious that the maximum load is always in the summer during air conditioning season when the hottest weather, like we had in June this year, the 95 to 100 degree weather when everybody's got their air conditioner on and using it for the most part. So the maximum load every year is going to be set by the maximum amount of energy produced and used, usually in the summertime. It just so happens now that we have 2 solar farms. We have one of the largest solar arrays in the state, that we have at least one way to help offset some of the exorbitant capacity, usually at the very peak load for Independence Power and Light. Not that we can depend on it all year long, and I understand we can only count 10% of that toward capacity, which is unfortunate because the capacity is always usually in the summer when the solar harvest is. That's when the most solar energy is harvested any place, is in the summer, at least in North America. So it seems to me that if the load has gone down significantly, that with the solar coming online this year and future years, that we're actually going to see not a great big increase in our load. I know it's projected in some of your figures. So I just wanted to add that because of what we have done with the solar farms, there's the potential, I think, that the load will not significantly continue to increase. So that's just an observation.
Absolutely, and that is something
Okay.
we'll get to on how you position, what do you want to do procuring capacity in the future to give you that flexibility where if that load doesn't show up,
Right.
or you can do it, that you're not so excess capacity. Absolutely. So load and energy, we're already kind of hitting on this right now, but one of the things that really drives your requirements is weather, and weather drives air conditioning load, as we know. So if you have a hot, dry summer, load goes up. So then in those particular years, you're going to have enough capacity to meet that, according to SPP. Other times, you're going to have far less. So here is a chart of your historical load, along with the forecasted load that we used for this study. So this dates back to 1997. You can see here the historical and forecasted. So starting in about 2013, you've seen a drastic reduction in the peak load, or peak demand, to be clear, use demand. And it's increased a little bit over the last few years, but as you can see, the forecast, which has been, I guess, a trend of the different utilities, is often a little bit more optimistic than what actually comes up. So that's something where when you're taking a look at these studies, we're doing a sensitivity evaluation of, hey, what happens if the load doesn't show up, or what happens if the load is greater than what the forecast is? How does that change our plan? So this was the load forecast that we used within the evaluation, and certainly we want to take a look at, if the load is lower than that, how does that impact your power supply portfolio moving forward? Here's a chart on the right now. The red is the forecasted load, or forecast of energy. Energy is a little bit easier to forecast than demand because demand is heavily dependent on weather from year to year. Energy is also driven by weather, but not necessarily as much because the air conditioners run all summer long. Whether it's mild or hot, it just depends on the usage amount. So energy is easier to forecast compared to demand. So then that turns into this BLR, which I think will help a little bit explain where we're at with your question. So this is called a balance of loads and resources. We're looking at how much demand must we supply and how do we get there. So on this chart, if you look at the black line, that's our forecast. The solid black line is the forecast of capacity. And then the dotted line above that is the 12% reserves that are required by SPP. That forecast can be changed year to year. The utility will submit that forecast every year to SPP, and then you are going to be required to have 12% of reserves over that. If you do not, if all of a sudden you don't procure enough capacity that particular year, then you will face some penalties, and it gets into the nuances of the tariffs and everything else associated with SPP. But there's certainly ways, if you are doing forecasting, to lower that black bar, if you will, which lowers the dotted bar through better forecasting or annual forecasting. So I think maybe that finally answers the question, and maybe not. But you kind of hit on it as well. The capacity has to be firm. It has to be dispatchable. There's a lot of studies going on within the industry of how do we account for firm capacity with renewable wind resources and solar resources. Right now, wind receives 5% capacity credit through SPP. Also, solar receives 10%. Now, that will change after 3 years of operation, because then if there's a very sophisticated calculation that goes into what is the actual firm capacity that you see on that particular resource, that you may be able to increase your capacity credit of that. For example, if your solar farm is producing better during those peak months for SPP. So it can go higher than that based on actual demand, but it takes a 3-year period to prove that out. And then just another, it's always, I think, important to look at, we talk a lot about peak demand and we talk about energy, but this is a chart showing what the hourly energy load is for the entire year stacked up from January to December. So you can see this was in 2017. The peak demand was around 280, it looks like, on that chart. So that's where the forecast was 300 on the black line on the previous chart. So you can see here it's at about 280, and then the energy underneath that is typically far less than that, especially during the winter months and spring and fall when air conditioning load isn't high in our area. So one other thing it's important to take a look at is where have you guys historically gotten your energy supply, and this is one of the things that's unique is you guys have had contracts and power plants in place that historically you've provided all of your energy. Obviously, the Blue Valley plant used to historically dispatch a lot more than what it does now. However, because the wholesale prices across the SPP have dropped dramatically, it's been able to save money as opposed to dispatching that unit. So being able to participate in the greater wholesale market has been able to, IPL has been able to leverage those less expensive energy resources. So what were the key components? We kind of already touched on this a little bit, but one, we needed to get a handle on the condition of your guys' units and how much money is it going to cost to continue to operate those. We wanted to review the existing power supply resources, the contracts and the plants that you had. What other new resources might be available for your own investment or participation in if there is another utility looking to purchase those. And then review your transmission reliability. You've operated a fairly reliable system over the years. Retirements may impact that, so we wanted to look at transmission reliability. And then once you determine and get all those costs associated, we have to do an economic cost-benefit evaluation. And the objective here is to determine the best. I always say the best because the best may not always be low cost. It may not, because of risks associated with a portfolio, just like a stock portfolio or anything else. You have to ascertain the risk associated with that portfolio against the cost, against environmental concerns. So that's where we take a look at all of these, and you just don't necessarily run to the bottom to the lowest cost, but you want to take into all the different factors of the risk that may be associated with those. So with that, we'll get into a few more of the data gathering items now with condition assessments. Did I answer the question on load reasonably? So what we did was a fairly exhaustive condition assessment of the Blue Valley units and the combustion turbines. And really what we wanted to do is review all the records, interview plant staff, take a look at what the condition of these facilities are, if they're aging, how much money is it, at the end of the day we're taking a look at how much money is it going to take to continue to invest in these resources to keep them reliable and safe to continue to operate and environmentally compliant. So one of the things we did was we took a look at a lot of different operating horizons. So what if we were just going to operate it for the next 5 years? What would that investment look like? If we were going to operate it for 10 years, what does that look like? And then 20 years for the entire. So you're going to have different levels of investment across that. As part of that, what we wanted to do is take a look at a benchmarking study. So this is a chart of the Blue Valley units. The x-axis is the age of the units against a benchmark, and I know it's a pretty small text, but what this is looking at is natural gas steam turbine units that are about the same size as the Blue Valley unit, between 10 megawatts and 100 megawatts. So the age of the units is on the x-axis. The y-axis reflects the fixed cost associated with operating those units. There's two little red dots on there, and hopefully, highlighted them there. That is where the Blue Valley costs currently are. So the costs are a little bit higher than the benchmarks of what we've seen over the years. If you take a look at the combustion turbines, did the same evaluation comparing those to the benchmark units, and you can see the costs are on the high side for 2 of the units, and the other I think 4 units are right in the middle of kind of where it is. And this is just to gauge where your costs have been against the benchmark and try to set the bar moving forward of where we need to go and spend cost. So with that, we also, sure, question.
I was just going to ask about the combustion turbines. You said 2 of them, if you could go back one slide, 2 of them were quite a bit more expensive to maintain, and then the others were kind of down in the pack. Which 2 are those? Are those the fuel oil units? There's 6 of them, I believe.
I think the the H units, which are the gas units, are, I think, a little bit higher cost just because they have been utilized more over the past. So they get called on by the market more often because they're using natural gas, which is a cheaper fuel compared to the fuel oil of the other units. So those units actually you spent more money on those units
More
because
maintenance.
they're being utilized more.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry that my computer shut down on me here to follow the slides a little easier. So one of the other things we wanted to take a look at is the reliability of the units compared to the benchmark. So the good thing that we see when you're spending more money on your units is you hope that your units are more reliable than the actual benchmark. So this chart here is showing the reliability of the Blue Valley units, and you can see the black line here is the fleet benchmark of similar type units, and you can see that the Blue Valley units, all but the 2015 year, exceed the benchmark. So that's a good thing. You're spending more money on the units, but you're getting better reliability out of those units. 2015 is an anomaly because that was when the fuel switch was going in, so the unit was out on maintenance, as you would expect. The combustion turbines, a little bit different. So you can see the H units here. So you have the H5 and H6, which is the dark blue and the gray, are the natural gas units. So those 2 units have had, for the most part, better reliability than the fuel oil units, and that's because they're being called on more, and it was a higher priority to spend money on those units just because they're being utilized more. So the overall, condition assessment results is, I think, what we've seen is you're spending more money on those units, but units have been maintained at or exceeding typical industry standards based on the reliability. However, even with high availability numbers, the units have experienced a few more forced outages, so they're getting up there. It's harder to maintain those resources. I think one of the things that we've seen is in order to continue to maintain those units and operate them, you're going to have to start spending more money on those units as they come about. So here's an example of just one of the units, and our full report will summarize all of this. Written report will summarize all this, but just for example, this is the Blue Valley Unit 1. So you can see the dark blue across the bottom is the overall just annual fixed O&M that you would expect for a unit to require just normal wear and tear on the unit. Depending on the operating horizon, you're looking at 5-year investment, 10-year investment, and 20-year investment. And as you can see, these numbers are not small, $1 to $2 to $3 million in certain years to continue to make sure that the unit can maintain its availability and reliability. Similarly, we did the same assessment for the combustion turbines to take a look at their maintenance. Now, the way combustion turbines work, a lot of times you have very, very lumpy investment in those resources because you overhaul the entire turbine. It's like overhauling the engine. So you put a bunch of money into the engine and it'll last for 4 or 5 years, and then you have to redo that again. So a little bit more lumpier of investment compared to the steam units. So then one other thing associated with the condition assessment was the power plant staffing review. And one of the issues, uncovered during the benchmarking review is the higher labor cost associated with that. So we took a little bit closer look at the overall staffing levels for the power production. And we wanted to review the organizational chart and the power plant operations and staffing levels and compare that against similar sized plants and utilities. And we considered two different operating portfolios. One is kind of what we'll say is business as usual operation for the Blue Valley and combustion turbines both being operational. And then what we wanted to take a look at is what if you retired the Blue Valley units and left the combustion turbines in operation, what a staffing level that might look like. So historically, the average has been considerably higher for IPL. But the good thing is during the course of this study, IPL has begun reducing the O&M staffing through natural attrition or job sharing to other departments, I believe, within the utility. So that's always a good thing when you're able to find opportunities to lower cost. We took a look at the two alternatives for no power plant retirements and the shutdown of Blue Valley. So overall, the overall observations, through those recent efforts, staffing now actually today, I believe, reflects very similar benchmark to our benchmark recommendations that is assuming no power plant retirements. And obviously, just as any organization, you want to be able to continue to assess that of where you may be able to shed costs depending on how the market changes. This is a pretty detailed chart showing, I guess the beige on the left is the Independence Power and Light. So there was two organizational charts that staff provided us, showing some different staffing levels for the power productions. The light blue in the middle are the benchmark units, either looking at different plants or different utilities that we've worked with over the years and showing kind of some of their staffing levels. And then on the far right, kind of highlighted with the green heading, is where we would see future operations for IPL. So as I said today, through the course of the last year, the staffing is around where the steam turbine generator and combustion turbine generator operation is around 44 people. And so with that, when you're taking a look at power plant staffing scenarios, your production labor cost goes down. So this is one of the things that we worked with staff based on, what does staffing look like at those power production facilities and what the labor staffing might be. So that goes through kind of the condition assessment, benchmarking assessment, staffing assessment of the facilities that you own here. Any questions on that before we move on to new resources?
So you're showing me what it'd be like if we maintain,
Correct.
just normal. Are you
Correct.
giving me a compare and contrast if we shut it down?
I will, yes. So right now what we're doing is just kind of what I said, gathering all the data. So what is it going to cost to continue to operate this, and then we'll start looking at different alternatives. So one of the things we wanted to take a look at is new resources. So one, new resources that you can build and own here in town, or if there's an opportunity to participate with a third party in external resources, if you will, that might be just out in the SPP, it might be out in Kansas, might be in Oklahoma, somewhere else. So one of the things that we wanted to do is, one, that we needed to estimate the installation cost associated with those, the capital cost. What's the O&M cost going to be to operate those facilities? What's the performance of those? How much fuel is it going to consume for natural gas resources? How many megawatt hours is it going to produce if it's a solar or wind facility? And we looked at a variety of different resources. So we looked at natural gas fired, whether it's peaking, whether it's combined cycle. We looked at renewable energy resources. And we looked at energy storage. So energy storage is making a lot of strides right now in the industry. So that's something that we wanted to take a look at as well. So we wanted to consider, as I said, all kinds of resources that are wholly owned by you guys or that may be owned as a third party. And I have underlined may, because anytime that you're looking at joining with a third party, you're contingent of that third party actually developing the power facility. So you don't necessarily, what I'll say, quote unquote, control your destiny. You have to rely on somebody else developing those facilities. And so all of these costs, again, are going to get put into the economic model to start comparing against now what does it take to operate and maintain your existing facilities versus some of the new resources that may be available. So here is the new, just a table, a snapshot of some of the new natural gas power plant characteristics. There's a lot of, you can see the technology aeroderivative. That's very similar to a jet engine that's hanging off the side of an airplane wing, except it's mounted on the ground and producing power instead. So very similar to that. You have a frame combustion turbines. These are very large machines, so you can see the capacity of those is just the individual unit itself is 200 to 300 megawatts. May not be a good fit for you guys when your total demand is around 280 to 300 megawatts, so you're putting all your eggs in one basket essentially if you would go with one of those options. But it's something that you want to throw, kind of throw everything into the evaluation. Reciprocating engines are a very popular choice for a lot of municipal utilities because they found that these are small increments, 9 to 18 megawatts, and you can stack up as many as you can or want side by side. And this is one of the technologies that a lot of municipal utilities have started deploying because they can control their own destiny and finding a balance between owning that generation and then also buying energy from the market. And then lastly, the combined cycle gas turbines. These are very big units, similar to the Dogwood facility that you guys currently are part owner of. Taking a look at the different classifications and whatnot where you would have to be a third party or a minority owner of a facility like this. The next few slides, sorry, skipped a couple. The next few slides, obviously there's a lot of words in there, and this is straight from our report, but just gives you some of the advantages and disadvantages of those turbines and technologies from each of you. I kind of highlighted a couple here, but I guess skipping to the renewable resources. So one of the things that, you take a look at renewables, one, you're already meeting your renewables mandate with the wind that you're purchasing and also the solar facility that you guys just had constructed. Locally, wind doesn't make a lot of sense here in town. The wind resource is not great. It's very, very windy today, I know, but it's just not the wind resource. Where we're looking at is Kansas, Oklahoma, where the wind resources are. That's where if you're driving down I-70, you see a lot of wind turbines out in Kansas. So regionally, the wind's going to continue to be developed. SPP has some of the most heavy wind-based resources as a percentage of the overall capacity and energy being provided in any of the regions. SPP is number one when it comes to wind energy. Local solar, obviously, the Midwest does not have the best solar resource. We've seen a lot of solar resources, obviously in Southern California and the Southwest United States where they don't have very many cloudy days. It's a little bit farther south, but nonetheless, solar does have its place in the portfolio, just to diversify that energy resource. And then lastly, just talking a little bit about the storage options. The industry, this is still very, very much in development. Some of these are a little bit more mature than others, but right now flow batteries and lithium-ion batteries, the conventional battery there, a lot of development is going into those, obviously with the battery manufacturers such as, obviously everybody's probably heard of Tesla and everything that they're taking a look at. Some of these are getting piloted by large utilities. The investor-owned utilities are piloting a lot of these programs. So battery costs continue to go down, but we don't have a lot of operational experience in the utility industry on batteries yet. So it remains to be seen what the real cost of these is going to be moving forward when it talks about how they get cycled every day with solar resources, with wind resources, and everything else.
One more question. I know this is really several years in the future before we have storage, some sort of an energy storage. But do you think that is what's coming for the big energy industry like IPL's in? I mean, are we looking? I know that Southern California is already putting in some storage capacity, some significant megawatt storage capacity. Do you think that's coming?
I think the industry is still. I think the industry is still evaluating it. And so when I'm helping utilities like yourself try to position for that, I want to keep all the options open as much as possible. Obviously, you still have to make decisions today and meet energy requirements and capacity requirements, but at the same time, position yourself that when and if, I guess if and when battery storage is here to stay or is economical, then you can start deploying that. And that's one thing when you're talking, you know, many years down the future, when you're talking about trying to operate your system very reliably, battery storage may be able to provide that. Do I think it's, you know, the silver bullet? No, but it's going to be very much provide some advantages if the cost can come down and operational things can come down to help integrate renewables into the system that are very intermittent, but if we can store that energy, be able to make it more firm capacity.
If I could just throw in my 2 cents, I think one of the ones that is not on your chart that potentially has great opportunities is fuel cell. So hydrogen energy, which as of next year, there's going to be hydrogen cars on the road in California. So it's already an energy source that's going to be used, and it may be an energy source that we could actually help produce. You know, it has to be produced with electricity, but it also is a storage medium for energy as well. So, thanks.
So those were the resources that we took a look at specifically within the technology assessment that would be new. One of the other things that we wanted to take a look at was resources that maybe wouldn't be new or built, but what happens if you would participate in an all requirements or partial requirements contracts where you just let another utility provide all those capacity and energy requirements. What if you purchased additional dogwood ownership? Obviously that is an option. What were some of the other as part of our business, we do a lot of these types of studies. We do power supply RFPs on the behalf of other utilities. So we have recent pricing that we've seen for those. So we didn't specifically do that in this study per se. However, we have that information based on experience with other utilities. We did receive a power purchase agreement from an unsolicited proposal that represents reciprocating engines. So we had some other forms that we're taking a look at. And again, it gets back to, I think, your question of, what's it cost to maintain and operate our facility? What are our new resource operations and then our options, and then what do we have available to us from third party, whether it's additional dogwood or some other neighboring utilities such as KCPL, Westar, Evergy that may be able to sell power to you. Another key component that we wanted to take a look at was the transmission system. So the on-system reliability. So the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, introduce an acronym to you guys, in cooperation with SPP and the ISOs is responsible for establishing highly reliable bulk electric system. They have a lot of policies and procedures that go into this, but essentially what is required is you have to have N-1 transmission reliability, which basically means that if one transmission element fails in your nearby area, that the lights don't go out. The bulk electric system stays very, very reliable. With that said, your guys' system can provide with no on-system generation. So if all the combustion turbines, all the Blue Valley units were retired, you would be able to comply with N-1 conditions. However, you guys have historically decided to operate your system at N-2. Well, at N-2, what you're seeing is now we have two major transmission elements are out, and if you do not have the robustness of your system, then you would be forced to start shedding load, which means turning people's lights out. So historically, you guys have always operated the system to where you can operate at an N-2 level without having to shed load. However, if you're looking at retiring all the on-system generation, so all the combustion turbines in Blue Valley, you're looking at significant upgrades to the transmission system to be able to import all of that reliability without shedding load. So that was one of the things that we wanted to look at is what do the transmission system upgrades look like depending on what your power supply is. So if you have everything retired, or if you have Blue Valley just retired, or nothing retired for that matter, what does your system look like? So that's one of the options that we took a look at. And you can see here the cost of those different retirement scenarios.
I'm sorry, would you just go back and explain that one more time?
Sure.
The N-1 versus N-2.
So the way so this is the best way I had it explained to me, again, being a mechanical engineer, not electrical. You think of rush hour traffic, we're at our peak demand, rush hour traffic, everybody's going 65 miles an hour, hopefully nobody's speeding, but if you have a traffic accident and you close one lane of traffic, now you're at an N-1 scenario, everybody gets to keep going 65 miles an hour to work. That's what N-1 is. N-2 is designing a system to where you can lose 2 lanes of traffic and continue to go during rush hour, and nobody has to hit their brakes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question. I like using that analogy.
Yeah.
So, so here's the transmission upgrade cost that we're looking. So if you retire only Blue Valley, you keep the combustion turbines in operation. Very, I don't want to say very minimal cost, but when you're looking at the grand scheme of utility operations, less than $1 million. However, if you look at retiring any level of the combustion turbines, so the second one down there is retire, and if you were to replace Blue Valley with new generation, but you would retire the combustion turbines, you would be looking at potential upgrades to the transmission system. And then if you retired all of the on-system generation and replace nothing, what you would be looking at. And this is, again, to maintain N-2 reliability without shedding load. And these studies would have to be, these are very, very complicated studies. You'd have to work with SPP, your surrounding neighbors to do these, so these are approximate. So now we get to the economic evaluation. So like I said, all this is gathering data for the economic evaluation. So we have to take a look at all the cost and benefits associated with that. So obviously, to the last one, we're sitting there talking about N-2. There is a benefit of having N-2 reliability, because you don't have to, under those conditions, you don't have to shed any load. However, it costs money. So what's the cost benefit evaluation of all these different options? So as part of the economic evaluation, we needed to develop forecasts for both fuel and market energy prices, and we take a look at several different options when it comes to that. So here in the red shows the historical Henry Hub natural gas prices. It's very volatile. It's very weather dependent. It was much more weather dependent pre-natural gas fracking, because hurricanes would hit the Gulf and you would see huge price spikes. But now natural gas fracking has come in and has made pricing much more, or I guess less volatile. As you can see, since 2009, not near as many price spikes. The main price spikes you do see in there have to do with cold weather events, such as the polar vortex. In 2014, we saw prices spike quite a bit. Taking a look, we showed two natural gas forecasts here. One is the low natural gas forecast. This reflects what Henry Hub is trading at on NYMEX, or what was formerly known as NYMEX. I think they've changed their name, but basically NYMEX prices. The high natural gas, which is the green forecast, represents what the Department of Energy Information Administration forecasts out. So this, we've historically seen that this is a pretty good bandwidth on where natural gas prices go.
Did they forecast the spike?
No, because that's weather related.
So anything in the forecast can be weather related from here?
Yes, absolutely. You have spikes that could adjust it. Let me see. Take a look. But again, at the same time, when you have a mild winter and natural gas storage ends up becoming quite a bit, you see that prices drop down to $2, less than $2, and we saw natural gas trading.
Well, this is from 2000, and there was a spike. I mean, I don't get from this graph a mean.
Well, since natural gas fracking has come in to play, the volatility of natural gas prices has. So there's been a fundamental change in natural gas supply in our country since natural gas fracking.
So you're telling me that offsets the data from before?
I would say that the historical volatility pre-natural gas fracking is significantly higher due to weather events.
So fracking is going to take out, in some degree or percentage, spiking.
Correct. It will not be nearly as extreme. And that's where, if you look on this graph in 2014, That was where the polar vortex happened, where a significant amount of the country was experiencing cold weather. So demand was extremely high, and we saw that the average Henry Hub price was just over $5 in MMBTU. So that's the type of peaks we're seeing now, very short term. So there's still going to be some weather-related peaks in there.
And that's the high end of your, I'm assuming, because this isn't in color.
It is up there.
Yeah, I know it's up there. I can see up there. I'm assuming that that's the high end,
Yes, that is the high end.
and
for
this is the
forecast.
low, and the mean would be between.
Correct.
And the mean for that is running historically, if this graph is almost right on. You see those two peaks behind your
Yes.
two projections? Well, you got to take out, because of the fracking, the extreme. And you're telling me that this would bring us back to a more stable, if you take the mean between your two projections.
That would be another forecast point, and we did run, that's a medium gas case that we did run. I was just showing the extremes here. So I guess what I'll say is the low forecast is based on what actual trading is happening right now on the NYMEX futures market. So that's the low forecast. The high forecast that we're showing here is the Department of Energy's forecast. So they're not predicting volatility per se because of hurricanes or other weather events. But what
So the
they're-
bottom part is your projection, and the top part is
the bottom part
the
is
industry?
the bottom chart is the trades from NYMEX. We're taking the actual trades from NYMEX. So then one of the things that we need to do is, one, take a look at natural gas prices impact the price of power in the wholesale market. So we ran simulations to look at the overall wholesale market energy price. Again, you can see the historical prices here. And as we talked about before, the fundamental change with renewables and natural gas prices has brought gas prices down. And this follows natural gas prices as well. So those are the forecasts. So just some financial assumptions. We took a look at 20-year planning horizon, interest rate 5%, financing term of 30 years, 20 years for dogwood since it's a little bit older of a resource. It's not brand new, general inflation, discount rate. So just kind of standard financing assumptions. So one of the things, as you can imagine, we develop a lot of different options to look at. So we have to try to start screening these down. And one of the evaluation tools that we use is the levelized cost of capacity. And what this is doing is it's accounting for all the costs associated with the facility. So the fixed expenses, variable expenses, fuel cost, debt service expenses, and then also taking into account any revenue that can be made from selling energy into the SPP market. So we wanted to account for that. So this is a screening tool that we use. And so here's a chart that shows all of the different resources that we looked at for capacity in this case. So on the far left, you can see the new power plants. So it's highlighted by the red bracket. That's the aeroderivative, F-class, combustion turbine, reciprocating engine, a couple of different combined cycle resources. In the middle of the chart, you'll see the existing IPL power plants, so the Blue Valley power plant, and then the combustion turbines. And then you can see on the far right would be third-party options such as additional dogwood, a couple of the different proposals that we received, and then partial requirements or some general bilateral contracts as a proxy. So the one thing that you see that jumps out at this, and of course you don't necessarily make any decisions just based on this chart. This is just a screening tool to help us start guiding us further into the evaluation. But the one thing that you see here is the Blue Valley units are more expensive than a lot of the other units. The other thing that you see is the combustion turbines are one of the lower cost resources compared to other resources on here. The other thing that you'll see on the far left under the red back here on the new power plants is The bigger the better when it comes to cost. You get economies of scale. So the bigger combustion turbines, the bigger combined cycles end up lowering costs just because you get economies of scale. However, those are options that you're not necessarily able to do on your own. You're going to have to find partners in order to participate in those types of projects. And then over on the far right, you can see the additional dogwood purchase is fairly cost competitive, along with some of the other PPAs that would be available to you if you were to do a power supply RFP or something like that. So again, we didn't solicit any proposals or anything from anybody on this specifically, but we're just using in-house information that we had to serve as a proxy. So after taking a look at screening some of those resources, what we wanted to do is start looking at a portfolio optimization, and really this is where you get into sophisticated system modeling of how each of these resources will dispatch against other power plants every hour of the year for 20 years. So you're talking about a lot of data that you're looking at. What we're trying to do is, what the model is doing is trying to determine the lowest cost combination of resources. Obviously we have certain factors that have to be included in there with environmental compliance and other things, renewable mandates and whatnot. And what the model does is it takes a look at both power plant retirements, and it's also going to look at additions based on the load forecast that's needed. So what we found was, when we were doing this evaluation, there were three kind of common paths within the portfolio optimization that were occurring. One was, okay, what happens if we continue to operate the facilities as is, business as usual with no retirements? The other option was, okay, the model was starting to say, let's retire Blue Valley. And lastly, it was saying, okay, what happens if we retire Blue Valley and the combustion turbines? So each of those unique paths, or each of those paths is going to have different additions to account for the capacity required, because there's different levels. So first path, and this is a chart showing basically the years that we were looking at, 2019 through 2038, path 1 and 2. These are the business as usual paths, no retirement. So if you remember from the BLR earlier, your long capacity, the bars for your capacity were much higher than your load requirements. So here we're showing we don't need to buy any more additional power plants under these paths, because your existing resources provide sufficient enough capacity to meet that. However, as we said, what happens if one of the plants does get retired? So in this case, here's the BLR now reflecting the retirement of Blue Valley. And so you can see that now the bars have dropped down. This shows the retirement of Blue Valley occurring after 2019, so in 2020 timeframe. You can see that now capacity is short, or deficit capacity, based on the load forecast that we were using and the reserve margin requirements, is around 58 to 59 megawatts. So again, that doesn't mean today you have to go out, if you were to retire Blue Valley, go out and buy 58 to 59 megawatts. It's going to be based on your load forecast in those years of how much you're going to have to maintain. So when you're starting to think about resources, and what it does is, how do you fill that 58 megawatts? It may not be 58 megawatts, it may be lower. So what resources do you do to go start filling that gap? And that's what the model is going to take a look at, is start filling that gap with the most economical resources. And so this next slide shows what's labeled as paths 3 through 7. So this includes the retirement of Blue Valley, and we're showing it retiring at the end of 2019. And then some different cases on capacity additions. So in path 3, what we're assuming is that you just go out and sign up bilateral contracts for capacity on a short-term basis, and you don't necessarily participate in any new facilities or anything else. You're just going out and contracting capacity, basically through neighbors or whoever's willing to sell it to you. Path 4 represents 25 megawatts of additional dogwood, so you'd maintain your existing 75 megawatt position, but you would add 25 megawatts to that, and then just go to the market for all the different, through bilateral contracts for that capacity. Path 5, what happens if you look at 50 megawatts of dogwood? As you can see, then your capacity that is required by bilateral contracts comes down because you have 50 megawatts of dogwood. Path 6 represents what happens if you retire the facility. In the short and midterm, you take a look at just procuring capacity to bridge to your new plant. For example, if you replace the Blue Valley plant with a 6x6 engine reciprocating engine plant, that would be about 110 megawatts. And then past 7 takes a look at, okay, what happens if we retire Blue Valley, add 50 megawatts of Dogwood, but look at retiring one of the substation units, one of the combustion turbines, and putting in a new reciprocating engine at that site. So a lot of different combinations here. The model ends up spitting out hundreds, if not thousands of these, so we have to go through and look at unique paths to make sense of it. There's a little bit of art, a little bit of science involved with that, but that's where you start taking a look at some of these options. For example, one of them that you won't see on here is 200 megawatts of an F-class machine. That's the large frame unit that's 200 to 300 megawatts. Well, we eliminated it from further consideration because realistically, you guys developing your own machine like that and having that much capacity on one machine is not feasible, even though it would have been one of the lower cost options.
Let me clarify something on this chart, and maybe this isn't the right place to answer this question. Is this just talking about what we need for our customers, or is this including what we need to be able to satisfy our obligation as Southwest Power Pool?
Those are one and the same.
Okay.
So in order to at Southwest Power Pool requires you to submit a load forecast
Right.
Each year based on what you think your customers are going to need. And so by doing that, then that sets where you need to have your capacity.
So it doesn't include if we bought excess capacity?
No.
You don't have a scenario in here?
No, we did not have a
Okay.
scenario. Well, it's a little bit in there in a way, but what we're doing is basically by relying on a combination of resources such as Dogwood and then go into the market, you can see that we looked at 5 megawatt increments. So we're trying to minimize the amount of excess capacity that you're buying to meet those, because historically what we've seen is, when power prices were good, natural gas fracking, a lot of utilities were able to sell wholesale power economically. What we're seeing that is that market has eroded and the margins are just not nearly as great in the wholesale market. So procuring excess capacity has an inherent risk associated with it, even though it may look attractive because you can sell money into the market. It does have inherent risk if market economics change.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, if I could just ask, she asked about excess capacity, but we are talking about the required capacity, which is 12% above, projected to be 12% above the load that we project. And that would be excess capacity. The 12% would be excess that we're projecting that we have to be above what our projected load is.
Yes, that is correct. NERC through SPP requires that all utilities hold a certain level of reserve margin above their load to make sure that the system is operating in that N-1, N-2 scenario.
Right.
So excess capacity, the way I define it, is holding excess capacity above your reserve requirements, not just above your load.
Okay. And our reserve requirements, though, if we shut down Blue Valley, are going to be 58, right now at least, 58 to 59 megawatts of power that we need to replace for capacity.
That's
what
right.
you're saying. Unless we lower the projection.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
You can submit a lower load forecast, knowing though that you can't make it go to zero.
Right.
Where there's penalties to be. There's an
if we're too low, we're penalized.
Yeah, you're penalized, so you want to try to get it as close
that.
as you can, but not exposing yourself to too much risk.
Right.
So that's a great question. So yeah, a great observation. So in 2020, we were showing the deficit on the BLR was 58 megawatts. Well, here we're showing that you're procuring 60 megawatts of capacity through Dogwood, 50 megawatts plus 10 megawatts of capacity through a bilateral short-term contract.
So Mike, in every scenario except Path 6, in future years, we're going to have to buy more capacity. That's what your chart
That's
is
right.
saying.
And the model is simulating that because excess capacity comes at a cost that you don't necessarily need. So it's trying to dial it in as close to your requirements as possible. Now, large power plants, if you're building a 100 megawatt power plant, that comes in a little lumpier. So it's a little bit more difficult to build that perfectly to the size. So there may be an overbuild situation where the cost may warrant, you've mobilized, you've developed the site, you're going to grow into it if your load continues to grow. Oop. So then lastly here, paths 8 through 13, this is a combination of retiring Blue Valley and retiring all of the combustion turbines, or a variety. Paths 12 and 13 look at retiring the combustion turbines kind of staggered over time. So in this situation, one of the things that we took a look at is we saw the levelized cost of capacity through the screening curves that Blue Valley was less economical than combustion turbines. And that shows up in the model where it's choosing to retire Blue Valley units earlier than the combustion turbines. And again, the same type of analysis goes here. When does the units get retired? Then we have to replace that capacity with something. In Path 8, again, 50 megawatts of dogwood, and then excess capacity after that. So you can see in 2024, 2025, if you retire all of your on-system generation, you're looking at a lot of capacity that you're having to purchase out in the future. Now, the model is also taking a look at the cost of capacity, but also the cost of energy in the SPP market and your contracts and the wind and the solar and everything else. So energy is not absent here. Here we're just talking about capacity because that's what triggers an investment requirement as you retire units. Any questions on this, or you guys want me to explain any more of the paths? Or
Questions?
exciting stuff, I know. So here are all the paths, and this is getting really small, I know, but it was mainly for the printout, but this is all the paths included here. And so then when you take a look at looking at the NPV, so what the model does is it takes a look at just the net present, not just the net present value, but looks at the net present value, and it tries to get the low cost options in the net present value for each of these resources or these paths. So you don't make a decision strictly based on net present value because there's a lot of other things that have to go into annual cost and whether you can borrow the money or whether it's going to impact rates or anything like that. So you don't necessarily make a decision based on, again, go to this chart, and whichever one is the lowest cost, that's your answer necessarily, because it doesn't necessarily account for some other risk associated with it that are hard to quantify within the model. But you can see this has kind of got a little bit of a rainbow color to it. So green is reflecting lower cost options, and red are the higher cost options. So one thing that we wanted to take a look at was the power supply requirements. So the top line of the NPV there represents the power supply ranking, and then below that we added in those transmission costs for operating the system at an N-2 reliability, because that's a choice that you guys can make of how that may impact the system. So that's the second line that represents that. So as I said, and we'll kind of bring up some more summary points, just want to make a couple more points here first. So this chart is showing the annual power supply cost for those 20 years from 2019 to 2038. Here we're taking a look at Path 1 and Path 2. So Path 1, if you'll remember, is no retirements, business as usual. This would represent staffing of around 57 or 60 power production. Path 2 represents a reduced staffing around 44 to 45, I believe it was, I think 44. So right now you guys have, through the last few months or past 12 months, have been able to reduce those costs. So right now you're operating essentially on Path 2 when it comes to operating those power supply costs. So then want to take a look at throwing up Path 5 and Path 8. So Path 5 represents retiring Blue Valley. Obviously now if you're talking about retiring Blue Valley and only operating the combustion turbines, you now have staffing issues that will have to be addressed because it takes a lot more staffing to own and operate a steam facility compared to combustion turbines. So we're showing that reduced labor from 44 to 23 positions, so that's something to be cognizant of. And then that reflects Path 5. Let's see. Path 5 represents 50 megawatts of dogwood, purchasing an additional 50 megawatts of dogwood. So then what you can see is Path 5 is a lot lower. So one, it's a lower MPV in the chart, and then when you look at the annual cost, it shows that it's a lower annual cost compared to Path 2. If you take a look at Path 8, which is looking at the continued combustion turbines, but those combustion turbines get retired in 2023, so now you have to go out and procure capacity and energy, or namely capacity, out in 2023 timeframe. So now you can see those annual costs go up, as represented by the green bar. So that MPV was still lower cost within there, but here you can see where those cost savings are in those first few years. So what this tells us is the combustion turbines are providing, even with all the investment that we've looked at in the condition assessments, that the retiring those combustion turbines is more costly than keeping them operational. And so basically, from the results of the portfolio optimization, kind of hit on these a lot and don't necessarily want to belabor them, but it's showing that the retirement of Blue Valley is an opportunity to reduce the cost. That unit is obviously coming to the end of its useful life. It's going to require a lot more investment to keep it operating. It's not as efficient as what a lot of the newer technologies are, and certainly with the increased renewables and the flexibility, or its inflexibility to dispatch in the market, makes it just a higher cost unit. The continued operation of the combustion turbines, on the other hand, does provide a great deal of economic value right now, and it's not through energy, it's through capacity. Their dispatch is very, very low. They don't produce a lot of energy. However, they do provide a low-cost source for capacity and meeting those capacity obligations. Then what we saw was dogwood and market capacity purchases or bilateral contracts for peaking resources are very low-cost options as well for replacing any of those requirements. The addition of on-system resources would be a little bit more costly is what we saw, and that's because of the opportunity for economies of scale. You're looking at deploying smaller power plants, whether it's 30 megawatts, whether it's 100 megawatts, compared to some of the off-system opportunities that you may have through partnerships with other utilities. And one thing that we saw, and I haven't presented all those, is we did a sensitivity evaluation with low gas, with high gas, medium gas, low load, high load, different opportunities. The one nice thing is the deltas between a lot of those costs will vary. However, the paths themselves and the ranking of those paths themselves do not change, where it's showing that under any of the various conditions, the retirement of Blue Valley looks to lower cost. Keeping the combustion turbines for capacity provides good value, and then how do you go out and procure additional capacity, whether dogwood or market purchases of PPAs makes sense. And then just for example, another thing that you have to take into account is, especially for dogwood or any investment, is additional capital expense. So what are you looking at expending for capital, because contracts look a lot different than when ownership, because now you're having to go out and get bonds and whatnot. So here, if you're looking at the additional 25 megawatts of dogwood, purchasing it in 2019, you're looking at spending upwards of $20 million. It's economical based on what it's been shown in the model. However, that's treated a little bit differently than if you're signing up for a bilateral contract, which may provide the same economic benefit, but you're not having to spend capital. And then the next chart shows, okay, if you were looking at 50 megawatts of dogwood.
Question.
Uh-huh.
So this last chart about 25 megawatts of dogwood versus 50 megawatts of dogwood. So in both those scenarios, we would own a larger share of that gas-fired plant, which has benefits both for ownership and producing it at a very low cost, but also being called on by Southwest Power Pool and selling that energy, correct? Because there is a benefit. When you have an efficient and a low-cost plant, it's going to be called on more by Southwest. So is there going to be some offsetting benefits to buying this type of energy from Dogwood or another power plant that's a very efficient plant? Because it is going to give us a stream of income, right, to IPL.
So
Versus ownership, if we don't own it and buy the excess energy off the Southwest Power Pool, and there is no ownership, then there's actually no overhead and maintenance of Dogwood, because if we own more of it, we're also going to be spending more to operate it and own it. So have you looked at those two scenarios, which would be more efficient as well?
So we did look at those scenarios. So the software program that does this simulates all of the cost associated with that, but it also simulates the potential market revenue selling it into the Southwest Power Pool. So when we had those earlier slides showing natural gas cost, that's the cost that all the plants would be using, but also that we had the simulated market price for wholesale power, so that would represent how much the opportunity to sell into that market. So we're taking both into account the revenue potential for Dogwood per se and the cost associated with that.
So it does take all that.
So it does take that into account. But your point is, I think, spot on, where yes, you may have the opportunity, if you invest in Dogwood, to I guess profit by selling selling energy into the SPP market that would help offset some of those fixed costs. However, you also have the risk associated with battery storage comes into play, more renewables come into play, load doesn't show up, and market prices continue to fall. Now you're stuck with an investment that is not necessarily in the money. So there's that risk reward all the time, and I think that's where, when you're looking at filling up that gap, if you guys choose to retire any of the resources here with a combination of resources. Maybe it looks like some Dogwood, maybe it looks at bilateral contracts. I don't think there's just one answer. You have to fill that 58 megawatts is illustrated here. You don't have to fill that 58 megawatts necessarily with just one resource.
Thanks.
So you're skipping ahead on me.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. You're moving me along. You want me to? So a lot of this stuff we've already talked about, but some of the major conclusions, and we'll kind of focus on some of the recommendations and next steps, and things to consider. But the condition assessment, your units have been very reliable in the past history. Obviously, they're aging, and your O&M costs have been quite high, but you've seen that in the reliability numbers. As they age, you're going to have to continue to spend money on them. The Blue Valley units, I think we've illustrated, they're quite a bit higher. The combustion turbines are providing low capacity. New on-system replacements obviously are a little bit higher than off-system. We kind of talked about that. And I think that the point here is, one of the things that we noticed in the evaluation was IPL has sufficient energy under contract. So with all the power purchase agreements, all the wind agreements, obviously the solar facility now coming in, you have sufficient, and then the ability to go to the SPP market and provide your energy. You have sufficient energy needs. So really what the focus of the plan moving forward, at least in the short term, to me, is looking at capacity. How do you fill those capacity obligations to maintain your flexibility moving forward, to continue to evaluate opportunities? So kind of hitting on the renewable goals, you're meeting those renewable goals through wind contracts and the solar project. Again, that N-1 versus N-2 reliability may shift if you look at retiring all of your on-system generation. Dogwood and third-party contracts appear to be lower cost opportunities compared to Blue Valley specifically. And then one of the other things is replacing one of these combustion turbines. So the combustion turbines are aging. They're not going to last forever. Obviously, they are showing up that they're fairly cost effective right now. However, one of the things that you may want to look at is replacing one of those facilities. And again, it's not necessarily the lowest cost option, as we saw in the chart. That's a little bit more expensive. But does that allow you guys to stay in the generation business and creating and having a nice flexible resource on system? that will be able to provide better reliability with your combustion turbine than your existing combustion turbine. So something to consider, definitely, but it's obviously not the lowest cost resource. So I guess when it comes down to recommendations of what we've seen is, based on the results, it shows that the retirement of Blue Valley likely makes sense, that from a power supply standpoint. That's not the only decision that goes into whether you retire a plant. Obviously, there's a lot of other issues that are associated with that. But from the power supply standpoint, it shows that ceasing electric generation at Blue Valley makes sense. So if Blue Valley is designated for retirement, that triggers a lot of other activities that are going to have to take place in the near future. One, you have to select a retirement date for that. That depends on what options are available for replacement. To further belabor the resource and the load forecast is SPP requires a certain level of your capacity to be firmly delivered to this area. However, your reserves can just be as part of the pool. So there's studies that are going to have to take place to make sure that you can get firm delivery at least to your load point. And again, the staff's very well aware of these things that would have to be take place. SPP requires a minimum of 100 days of notice or 6 months notice of any retirements. And obviously, if you're going down the retirement plan, now you have to come up with a closure plan for the facility, any decommissioning or demolition activities. There's a whole host of things that have done. Some people close the plants, they close them off to make them safe so people can't get in unsafe areas. They demo certain pieces of equipment that may be a safety hazard from falling over as they age, but a lot of folks push off full demolition of the facilities because it's not absolutely required right now. Now we're seeing a lot more demolition occurring now because scrap prices are high because of the steel tariffs. So we're seeing a lot of people retiring those facilities now. But that's something to be considered. Just because you're retiring a facility doesn't mean you have to demolish it immediately thereafter. There's some other things to take into account. And then obviously with the retirement, you'll have to continue to evaluate the power production staffing and optimize what that'll look like moving forward. The combustion turbines, for the foreseeable future, I would say continue to operate those and invest in those. They provide low-cost capacity, and as we saw within the modeling, even with the level investment that we're putting into them, they still remain very, very cost-effective. One of the things that, in working through the condition assessment and working with the staff, is I believe they test run each of those facilities quarterly, and every time they turn them on, they're an aging resource. Some hiccup might occur that they have to problem solve and fix. These resources, in order to maintain reliability on the system, are low enough cost that maybe exercising them more often than once a quarter, maybe every other month, maybe once a month, maybe something to consider. Just like we store our lawnmowers over the winter, and the first time you get it out, you don't know if it's going to start up or not, but then once you get it running, all summer it typically runs well. Same is true with power plants, so maybe exercising those resources a little bit more may be worthwhile. There's some permitting adjustments to get into. One of the things of taking a look at operating risk, and we've informed staff of some of those issues of making some permitting changes, so that's something that maybe should look into. And then just continue to reevaluate the combustion turbines and these types of efforts when master plans, because you never know when that next technology such as battery storage is going to come into play, or what the market looks like, that eventually those resources might change. So with that, one of the other things that needs to be done is begin the process for conducting a power supply RFP, or request for proposals. As I've kind of said, the RFP should focus on low-cost capacity resources. SPP, Energy Market, and your other contracts are providing a good amount of energy, so we want to focus on capacity with that. And then really it should look at a combination of resources, and I think it gets to the point of how do you fill in that, what we're showing is 58 megawatts, but it's up, it could be lower. depending on the load forecast, but what does that look like? A variety of contracts versus ownership, looking at short-term, mid-term, and long-term options. Now that process can take up to 6 to 12 months because there's studies that have to be done by SPP. Obviously, you have to issue an RFP, you have to get proposals back, you have to evaluate those, you have to vet the contracts and language and cost and everything else. So it's certainly not a super quick process, and it can take longer. Some evaluations are longer than others depending on the number of options that you're reviewing, as well as the firm delivery of power to your load center here. And then one other thing that continue to take a look at is obviously the repurposing of the combustion turbine sites. So those are providing good, reliable local electricity. They're aging. Certainly, I don't think the economics are saying to replace those facilities today. However, doing a little bit more due diligence on what it might take to convert one of those, retire one of those combustion turbines or one of those sites, and potentially put in reciprocating engines is something certainly worth looking at, whether site and constructability assessments, can you get natural gas to some of the new sites, what are those costs, what are the permitting issues going to be, and just doing a little bit more research on that. So I think, the major considerations moving forward is, one, evaluating these impacts in the electric rate study. Obviously, this is taking a look at the wholesale power supply side. Now we need to take it, the results of this, and move that into an electric rate study and see how that's going to fall out to the retail side. Definitely want to consider short-term decisions that allow flexibility for future. One of those is energy storage. We kind of hit on that. You want to be able to, when that technology, or if that technology becomes much more mature on the market, you want to make sure that you can position the utility to be able to pounce on opportunities like that in the future. So you want to make sure you're setting yourself up to be able to take that. Obviously, capital expenditures deployed today may limit future opportunities. So something that you want to make sure to take into account of how much, for example, Dogwood or other ownership opportunities that may come through the power supply RFP are looking at of how much capital are you willing to spend today, because it may limit you on the capital spend you can do in the future. Another key component is how much capacity do you want to have in a single resource. So we talked about the large frame units being 200 megawatts would be too much. Well, right now you own 75 megawatts of Dogwood. If you're looking, the examples we had here was looking at 25 megawatts or 50 megawatts of Dogwood, which would take you up to 100 to 125 megawatts total. Your load is around 280 to 300 megawatts. So now you're looking at putting up to 1/3 of your capacity requirements into one resource. And while it's a very efficient resource and fairly low cost, it's just something to be cognizant of when you're taking a look at that. And certainly a mix of resources to account for the variability of the load forecast. So this kind of gets back to an earlier question of how do we want to account for that load variability when it moves up and down, and a mix of resources that allows you to have short-term capacity obligation or short-term capacity contracts where you can re-up those every other year. You do run the risk that prices may increase over time. So that's one thing that, it's just like any hedging function when you're taking a look at hedging your energy and your capacity, that you're going to pay a premium to hedge for a longer time. You lock in that price. However, if you're looking at, 1 or 2 year contracts, it may make sense to take into account that price risk, because it allows you to position your portfolio for changes in your load forecast. So, and then position IPL to maintain on-system power generation for both economics and reliability. It kind of goes to, like we're saying, we're not seeing the reciprocating engines make sense to replace the combustion turbines today, but you don't want to make a decision today that limits that, potentially that ability in the future if the economics do flip. So with that concludes kind of our discussion. So any more questions? Thanks for bearing with me with something that's pretty technical.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. Are there other comments or questions?
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
this has been a very insight presentation we've all heard tonight. For me, it highlights just how expensive our operating practices have been and continue at IPO. Because of that, I'd like to request that the city manager take the necessary steps to issue an RFP towards the process of purchasing some more power. To me, we have an obligation to these ratepayers out here to be more competitive, which I said before this presentation a few months ago, to also make these necessary steps to make economic development more attractive. I think it's time that we move forward and quit sitting around on this and make some decisions.
Okay, is there any objection from the council to direct the city manager to begin working on an RFP? Yes?
Just a couple questions. RFP for how much power, and are we, is it just to replace power at Blue Valley? Is it to replace the power at the combustion, or both? And so, I mean, we need to be specific if we want to request something. Is it
For
just Blue Valley? Just Blue Valley?
Yes.
If I may. The difference here, you're saying that our contracts are efficient enough to R2 without not in capacity, but in actual load. Blue Valley has, let's just round the number off so that we don't have to go to 60. We don't usually use Blue Valley. That's capacity.
Mm-hmm.
That relieves us or honors our contract with SPP.
So so you can retire.
And
Blue
we
Valley,
still run at R2.
or N minus 2. With
N
some-
minus 2,
With,
okay.
with some
N,
upgrades,
right.
yeah.
Okay. So, but in order to honor our contract, we have to have that much capacity.
You don't have to have all the capacity currently from Blue Valley, because Blue Valley is right now has 98 megawatts of capacity credit, but you're over your reserve requirements. So you will have to replace some level of Blue Valley in order to meet your capacity requirements. That's
And
correct.
this is just exactly what we want to do. We want to get it going so we get those answers to what it is. And we start the process.
So one of the things that you will need to take into account is when you want delivery of that capacity,
Well, certainly, but,
based on the retirement of the
right,
unit.
we can't do cart before horse. I mean, all of this, but that's why we have to get it started. It's going to take so long to do this. We can't go in with a precise number. You can't give us a precise number. Nobody can. I mean, that's why we have to open negotiations and start the process.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
You're telling me these generators go out in 2023 for major overhaul?
The combustion turbines, they have a variety of different maintenance schedules with all 6 of them.
Okay, so I heard you wrong. They're not going to be a major overhaul in 2023?
The maintenance schedule that we have has, I think one of the units will have a major overhaul probably immediately, because I think it was scheduled for this year and it was been delayed. So that one would likely have a major overhaul in the short term. But
Right.
depending on the condition of the units, depending on their utilization, that maintenance schedule gets set. So it's very real, and I don't have the numbers exactly with me, but
I think what we maybe not getting through the fog here is that we don't generate electricity or power. We have the capacity to do that, and that's what we're talking about here. The best way to move forward for capacity.
yeah, and with that, there's some level of investment in your combustion turbines in order to provide reliable capacity that you need.
If we do the level of combustions, I mean, and which I'm not saying is right or wrong. All I'm saying is that the capacity is what we're really,
Yes,
because our contracts now afford us the availability at a N2. Well, I'm all for this moving forward. I think
So-
we have to do it.
Councilman, just, would you, if you wouldn't mind, just saying again, what we're asking the city.
Requesting him an RFP to move forward on purchasing some power, and exploring it, yes. Mhm.
Okay, is there any objection? Okay. Mr. City Manager, are there other questions for the presenter? Yes. Yes, Councilman.
You said Blue Valley was 98% of our capacity according to the power pool?
It has a capacity rating of 98 megawatts.
Okay. What does that percentage count of our total?
Your total load is approximately 280, 290, plus 12% reserves on top of that. So around 1/3.
Okay. It just doesn't make sense because we generate less than 2% out there to keep that antiquated boiler system, spec it, repair it, staff it. When we really run it less than 2%, doesn't seem economically feasible. It does seem like a better idea to either replace the equipment or buy into another plant than to keep something that's in its lifespan and feel like it's able to cover a percentage of our power when we really rarely use it. Thanks.
Anything else? Agreed. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. City Manager, I have a couple questions for you. When was the last time we did a master plan for IPL?
I do not recall that off the top.
Thought I saw it on 2011.
2011?
I think that's what I've seen in here.
About right, I think that's.
I believe I've seen that.
Okay.
Mayor, I'm being told it's 2011.
2011. I mean, a couple of things that, why I asked that question is regulated utilities are required to do it every 2 years. I don't know if that's the right time frame, but all of the things that we will be considering that have been presented to us tonight are going to require years of thinking and planning. So that's one thing. The other is, I think as these decisions are being contemplated and as we're working forward on these, and still anticipating the cost of service study that's yet to come here in a few weeks, we need to provide, some security to our customers on our rate. So what I would like to ask for is, and I know that we have recently engaged a new financial advisor, maybe by our first meeting in October, if we could have a recommendation from you on our current rates, and how we anticipate those stabilizing or perhaps lowering over the near term as we work through all of these decisions. And also, I think it's very important that we go ahead and establish a routine schedule for master planning. I don't know if 2 years is the right time. I think 7 years is probably not the right time frame. But there's going to be multiple decisions made as we move forward with both our production and our rate classes. So if there's no objection from the council, I'd like to ask that you bring back recommendations on those two items to us at the October 1st meeting.
Yeah, we can certainly work together on that with our staff and the various parties that are working on that rate study right now to try to give some sense of the outcome of that to the council and some recommendations.
Okay, thank you. Councilman?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. To speak to, I guess, the matter at hand, Councilman Huff, can you explain to me, with all the amount of information that we've had laid before us, why it's prudent right now to put out an RFP? Can you just kind of walk me through your process? And you may be absolutely right, and I'm just trying to get a
Well, let's see,
understandable in my.
it was recommended in 2011, and no action was taken. And we're at 17. I'm just trying to get the ball rolling so that we at least figure out where the numbers are. Like I said, I'd like to see some these ratepayers' amounts reduced rather than go up.
Absolutely.
It sounds like to me that on this present way we're going, that they are going to go up, according to the presentation this evening.
Mr. City Manager, if we put out a request for proposal, that does not lock us into any type of contractual agreement with any person or any entity at that time?
It absolutely does not. What that allows us to do is provide more information to the council and make some data-driven decisions that are going to impact the long-term future of this community and the ratepayers.
So this would just give us a little bit more information to make a better overall financial decision?
Yes, absolutely.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Any other, yes?
Yeah, I think that the condition of Blue Valley and the turbines, we have to start moving. We didn't in 2011, and we're going to be caught short if we don't start the process at some point. And I know that, you know, that we as a council will take into consideration everything and vote on this. But until we get something to vote on, until we go somewhere and ask somebody, we're going to continue to be in bad shape.
I would probably put it in this context. We've heard it mentioned several times, and really the impetus for getting this particular study moving was that we know that Blue Valley is more than likely going to reach the end of useful life within the next 5 years. You know, that's an estimate, of course, but you know, reasonable minds can speculate that's going to happen. If you're looking at an RFP process, and if you go worst case scenario, that could take 12 months to, you know, develop, issue, evaluate, bring back some thoughtful recommendations to the council. You know, I've spent some time visiting with the city attorney. The last time the city did a purchase power agreement, which was with Dogwood, that was an 18 to 24 month process on top of that. So I think we're talking about moving in a very cautious manner, but a very thoughtful manner that will bring back some sound recommendations to the council, but make sure that we don't get caught flat-footed and leave ourselves vulnerable to power production in this city.
I totally agree that we should move with the caution, but we should move. I mean, we've been dotting all the I's and crossing the T's, and we have been moving forward. This is another forward move that we have to make for the future of this city, I believe.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
So my comments would be to the council. My cautionary tone is something that I'm going to be very adamant about. These decisions we make are obviously generational. They will impact us long after we are gone. They impact our citizens now. So the questions that I will ask and take caution with is because I want to make the best and the correct and the right decision as we move forward with this. I think our citizens demand that, and I think we should, as a council, cautiously evaluate and do that as well.
Anything else? I'm going to take a 5-minute recess, and then we'll come back with the rest of our presentation and staff reports. police housing incentives. Mr. City Manager, oh, you have.
Stand by.
No, that's unplugged.
No, yours is very much on.
Oh, okay.
Mine's unplugged.
He unplugged the wrong one. Go for it.
Okay. Okay, Madam Mayor and members of the council, that's really loud. We have a presentation tonight by our Truman Fellow, Kristen Ayers. You may recall a few months ago, we received direction from the council by way of resolution that was championed by Councilmember Huff to research a program that's being implemented in some cities across the country revolving around police housing incentive. The idea is to try to get police officers to potentially locate into distressed areas of the community in exchange for some sort of economic incentive. So our Truman Fellow has done some research on these cities, the way these different programs have looked, and wanted to update the council on that tonight. So at this time, I'll introduce Kristen Ayers for an overview of the Police Housing Incentive Program.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. Kristen Ayers, your Truman Management Fellow. Here to talk about police housing incentives. So first I'm going to go over the what and the why of what this program is. So police housing incentives are the subsidy of housing that can be rentals or home ownership by the city or the community. So there's rental incentives, which are good for younger or newer employees that haven't decided if they want to buy a home yet or might get them interested in trying a new city. Homeowner incentives, though, will probably facilitate a longer-term commitment from officers. So why do communities offer these incentives? There's really two main reasons. The first being encouraging public safety officers to live in the communities that they serve. And the hope is that benefits from this will be a decrease in crime, increased citizens' feeling of safety in their neighborhoods, and officers feeling more connected to their community. Another reason that communities do this is as a recruitment tool. Many cities have been struggling with filling officer positions, and we've struggled with that here in Independence as well. So this can be a good way to incentivize people to apply here instead of elsewhere. A couple of communities try and receive these benefits by having residency requirements for their police officers. So St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago do this, but these are very unpopular among officers. So before I go into what other cities are doing for police incentive housing, I wanted to give some context on our police department. So we have 206 sworn officers, and 48 of those currently live within the city. So there's 39 officers, 5 sergeants, and 5 captains. So that's 23% of our police force lives in Independence. Many cities want officers to live in the community to increase the perception of safety among citizens. Our citizen satisfaction survey asks citizens how safe they feel in their neighborhoods. The results from our 2016 survey showed that 83% feel safe during the day and 57% feel safe at night. So I'm going to go over some case studies of how other cities are implementing these programs. I was only able to find approximately 10 programs across the country, and I'm going to highlight 5 of those tonight, and these are all varied based on size of city, size of police force, and the types of incentives offered. So the first 2 cities I'm going to talk about are cities that partner with a nonprofit to administer their housing program. So the first is the city of Atlanta that has 2,000 officers in their police department. Their program is administered by the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that was established to support the police department. So they provide programs for crime prevention and emergency preparedness. At the start of their program, they had 22% of their officers living within the city. So the incentive that the foundation offers is a $1,000 cash incentive to relocate to the city. But really what this foundation does for the officers is puts together an inventory of discounted housing from various industry stakeholders. So they let the officers know when there's apartments that are offering courtesy units, when neighborhood developers are offering discounts, and they work with the community to put together this list for the officers. They also look for grants and other down payment assistance programs. I wasn't able to contact anyone in Atlanta to talk about this, but I did find an article that said in their first 2 years, which were 2011 and 2012, 6% of their officers took advantage of this program. And the program costs $178,000 a year to administer, and that's for staff and the $1,000 incentives. Because they have a police foundation, they're able to fundraise for their money, so their funding comes from corporate, foundation, and individual giving and fundraising events. The next city that partners with the nonprofit is the city of Chattanooga, and they have 500 officers in their department. So this is a partnership between the Chattanooga Police and Fire Fund for Home Ownership and the Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise, which is a housing-related nonprofit started in 2012. At the creation of their program, 42% of their police and firefighters lived outside of city limits. So this program offers the incentives for firefighters as well. So their incentive is $10,000 toward a purchase of an officer or firefighter's first single-family home, so they can never have owned a home before. Or they can get $20,000 if they buy a home in a designated revitalization area. The money is provided in the form of a forgivable loan, with 20% of the loan forgiven each year across 5 years. So if they leave during that 5-year loan period, they are responsible for the remaining balance. At the time of purchase, they also have to complete a homebuyer education class. The way that this was financed is the city provided $250,000 from the general fund to start the program, and the nonprofit handles the money after that. So the next 3 cities I'm going to go over are cities that run the programs on their own with their own funding source. So the first is the city of Chicago, which has 12,000 officers, so a really, really large department. Their incentive is $30,000 for a 10-year loan, so a lot longer loan period. This is also for police officers, firefighters, and paramedics, but it's only for targeted neighborhoods. They also have an income limit for buying a home for this program, so their household income cannot exceed 150% of the area median income. The way they finance this is the city of Chicago has an affordable housing opportunity fund, so they're using $3 million from that fund to fund 100 individuals. So the officers or firefighters must secure a mortgage from a private lender and agree to live in the home for the entire 10-year period, or repay $3,000 for every year that they don't live there. What's interesting about Chicago is they do have a residency requirement, so all of their police officers already have to live in the city, so this incentive is just to get them to live in their higher crime areas. 11 officers have utilized this program since 2017, which is actually a relatively small number, seeing as they have 12,000 officers. The next program is from the city of Avondale, Arizona. I couldn't find their department size, but their population is 76,000, so a little bit smaller than our department would be. Their incentive is a flat $20,000 to sworn officers and sergeants for the purchase of a home, and their loan options can take 2 different forms. They can do the fully forgivable over 5 years or deferred until sale, and they let me know that all of the officers so far have chosen the forgivable option. So the officer must stay employed and maintain the home as their primary residence for the entire loan period. And the way that they finance this is council appropriates $60,000 per year in the budget to assist 3 officers. And the program is first come, first served. The impact is that, since the start in 2012, they have assisted 14 officers, so almost 3 per year, at a total cost of $280,000. Lastly is the city of St. Helens, Oregon, which is a very tiny department of 17 officers, and they just started this program this January 1st, 2018. Their incentive is $25,000 for a down payment of a home, 5-year forgivable loan, like most of the others. What's interesting about their program is this is only offered for anyone that started after January 1st, or those that were hired before January 1st and live outside the boundaries of the city currently. The way this is financed is the city pays the $25,000 directly to the title company. They found 2 local credit unions that will hold the mortgages and not sell them off. The way that they fund this, the finance director said that since they never know how many people are going to apply for the program, they just use their contingency money. And since this started in January, 1 officer has taken advantage so far and 1 is interested. So I put this slide on here. If the council decides that police housing incentives is something that they want to look into and move forward with, after talking to the other cities, these are some things that I think we'll all have to think about. And the first is, do we want to limit the incentives to just certain areas of the city? All the cities do it differently. Some you can live anywhere and get the incentive, and some you have to live in the revitalization area. So that's something that we would have to decide. Next is, what about the officers that already live in the city before this program started? I think that they'd probably come to us and say, this new guy is going to get offered a $30,000 forgivable loan, and I chose to live here on my own. What about me? Who is included? So as I mentioned, some of the other cities include firefighters as part of this. So I guess we really have to decide what the purpose of the program is. If it's to lower crime and increase perception of safety, I'd say we'd probably limit it to police officers. If it's for recruitment, then it might be thoughtful to put firefighters in there as well. Next is, the program may not be popular. The other cities that are doing this, their programs are relatively new, within the last 5 or 6 years. So there's not a lot of data to show if this is working, as most of these communities only have 5 to 15 people that have signed up for it so far. And really, if you put yourselves in the shoes of the officer now and wonder why they don't live here currently, you'd have to imagine that it's because they probably don't want to live next door to someone that they might have arrested the day before. So they're thinking about their family safety as well. The next question is, should we put an income limit on it? The city of Chicago put the income limit of 150% of the area median income. Next is, how do we police the police? So how do we make sure that we're not giving them a loan and then they're going and purchasing a home and renting it out to make money, and that's not actually where they're living? So we'd have to think about how we make sure that that's the primary residence. And then lastly, is this just for first-time home buyers, like some of the other cities put on there? So that's everything that I have. So I'd love to hear your questions, comments, and what you think the direction should be moving forward.
Thank you very much. Comments or questions? Yes, Councilman?
Well, it's an interesting option. You've done a lot of the homework, and I appreciate that. One of the questions I had, with a number of items like this that are given by employers, the IRS usually views those as income. Did you ask or check to see if they have to pay tax on that as income?
I didn't ask that.
Passive or regular income, because
Yeah.
that may be a requirement as
Yeah.
well.
I
So
can
if
ask them.
If we gave them $10,000 for a down payment or $25,000, they may then have to pay the income tax on
Right.
that in that year, particular year. So
Okay. Anything else? Yes?
This is really interesting, and it's going to require even more digging. I mean, but this gets us on a road to where we want to go. The police officers and firemen is a real, for me, question. Do you know what percentage of our firefighters live in the city?
I don't. I could ask, though. I could figure that out.
one other question.
Councilman, were you finished? I'm sorry.
Are you finished?
Am I finished? Am I? No.
So, have we surveyed the police officers or talked to some of them to see what interest they would have, or if this would be a good recruiting tool for the future as well?
I talked to the chief a little bit about that.
Yeah.
No, we did not do a survey of them, but I think if this was something that you wanted to move forward with, that's something that we should definitely do and make sure that there's interest there before budgeting money for the program. And maybe the chief could speak more to that if he wants to, but.
So our intention always is to make our city safer. I mean, and to revitalize our neighborhoods. And I think there's possibilities that a program like this would help us do that. How popular it is in terms of how many people would take advantage of it, I mean, we know that the numbers are small, and that's probably not going to be different here in Independence. But I don't think that's, should be a reason not to continue to explore this. I mean, for me, the question is, how is it going to be funded? And the other questions that you posed as well. So, I mean, I appreciate the research you've done, and I think it's something that we need to continue to explore. Mr. Stevens?
I was simply going to add, Mayor, that as Ms. Ayers and I were talking about her research, I think our recommendation at the preliminary level would be, continuing to explore this. But if we have financial resources from a taxpayer-funded perspective, we'd probably find those best utilized on adding additional officers. This program really lends itself to partnering with a community partner. I think there's some nice synergies that we've thought about that could overlap with some other institutions and some missions they're trying to accomplish. So I think looking at exploring those, then you could look at killing two birds with one stone in that regard. But I do think this program has some merit to it, and certainly would have some attractive, as I said, partnerships and synergies with those other community partners.
Anything else? Thank you very much. Okay, this brings us to staff reports. First is short-term rental regulations update. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, back in March, staff, in response to some council direction, had brought you some options about regulating short-term rentals that are operating in the city. At that meeting, council gave us some direction. We went back, did some additional research, began meeting with some of our strategic partners, such as the Hotel Motel Alliance, some of our local bed and breakfast owners. Tonight, I believe we're in a very good position to provide some firm recommendations to you. Staff and community development has begun drafting some legislation in this regard. So before proceeding, we just want to check in and make sure we're on the right track, and then continue advancing on this issue. So I'll introduce our Assistant Director of Community Development, Charlie DeSelf, to share the presentation.
Thank you.
Good evening. As Zach said, I'm Charlie DeSelf, the Assistant Community Development Director. Get into this real quick, just a brief timeline. About a year ago, in the summer of 2017, we began a review of short-term rental issues that we have in the city, began looking at some of the regulations that we had in effect, and then possibly some issues with those regulations and what changes we probably should be looking at making. As Zach said, back in March of 2018, we did provide a study session presentation to council with some basic research that we had done to date. After that point, we had gotten together with our staff working group, kind of came up with a plan of action on how to attack this. In May of 2018, we met with the Hotel Motel Alliance. It was at that meeting where the Hotel Motel Alliance did request that we actually meet individually with the bed and breakfast operators within the city and get their feedback, since the issue was probably a little bit more to heart to them. We then, after meeting with that group, got back again with the staff working group, finalized some recommendations that we'll present this evening. So some of the concerns and feedback that we got out of those meetings, first from the council level, we didn't have a definition for short-term rentals. We were, at the time, still are, using the definition for a bed and breakfast. So council did request that we create a definition for a short-term rental. Create some unique rules as far as safety, parking, insurance requirements, and trash removal. Look at the impacts, mainly to the neighborhoods. Balance and protect the interests of those neighborhoods. Limit the roadblocks that we could possibly create by creating a new process for short-term rentals. And lastly, one of the more important issues is the licensing of these issues and the transient guest tax that currently most of them are not producing. Some of the issues that the bed and breakfast owners discussed was not only creating a definition, but creating a unique definition. Their concern was they did not want to be lumped in a group with these short-term rentals, Airbnb type uses. They wanted to make sure that the bed and breakfasts were separated as much as possible from these uses. Limit the number of guest rooms available in a short-term rental. Limit the number of days that they can be rented out. Impacts on a requirement for a city lodging permit. Currently, that lodging permit is necessary if there are 5 or more guest rooms. The management of the use, to make sure that there's an on-site manager, on-site property owner, or someone nearby that manages that use. And lastly, that no meal service be provided with these. Excuse me, not lastly, there was a few other things. They did touch on inspections as well, how these units get inspected, an application process. Bed and breakfasts currently have to go through a special use permit process, so creating somewhat of a similar process for these types of uses. How do we enforce on these things? That's a huge question. And then the penalties invoked on any non-compliance. And lastly, the license number posted on rental websites. I'll go into that one here in a little bit when we show our recommendations. So then going quick over our recommendations, first of all, we did create a definition. The definition states that a short-term rental must take place in a single or a two-family dwelling unit. Reason we limited to single and two-family dwelling units is if you get into a multi-family dwelling unit, at that point it could become a boarding house. Boarding houses require sprinkler systems. So we wanted to make sure that we did create that divide here and using the sprinkler system kind of as that level where we divide it to the next use. We do require that they be managed by a property owner or a property management company, that the use contains 4 or fewer guest rooms, there's no more than 10 occupants, no more than 2 adults per bedroom, and meals shall not be provided to guests. We go on to say that individual rooms shall not be rented to separate parties during the same period of time, meaning that you cannot rent these uses by the room. Only one party can rent out the entire unit, and they cannot be rented out for no more than 30 consecutive days. The 30 consecutive days thing is consistent amongst all our lodging uses, so we continue to carry that forward. A business license would be required, and as we mentioned before, a license number listed on all advertisements for the use. We do feel that that particular requirement from the staff standpoint would assist us in any enforcement on these issues, so we can, if we review a listing on a website, we can at least see what they're tied to as far as a business license. All the hotel, motel, and lodging regulations that are currently in place would be met. That includes the collection of the transient guest tax, guest name, addresses, vehicle info, and other information collected upon registration, and that rooms shall not be rented more than twice in a 24-hour period. Parking issues. For hotels currently, we require 1 off-street parking space per room offered. We're carrying that requirement over. However, you can get a credit of 1 space for every 18 feet of lot frontage that you had. So for example, if you had 60 feet of lot frontage, you could essentially get 3 credits to that requirement. So if you had 4 rooms, you would only be required to have 1 off-street parking space. Refuse collection, this was a big one, and I think this fits well with the Independence for All strategic plan, is that these uses shall have collection or refuse collection from a company, who is licensed to operate within the city. Life safety issues. First of all, a map identifying escape routes from the unit. Carbon monoxide detection, child-proof electrical outlets, emergency contact information. That can include the manager or property owner's contact information, as well as just some basic emergency personnel contact information. Fire extinguishers would be required, as well as smoke detectors. So then let's get into the application process for these, as well as the internal review. First of all, we would require an application that includes the name, phone number, and email address of the operator, the total number of bedrooms that will be rented out, and the total occupancy of the unit. These would be reviewed by city departments and city divisions to review conformance with city code. At that point, there would be a public hearing by the Planning Commission. Owners and tenants within 185 feet would be notified 15 days before that hearing, and signs would be posted on the property 15 days before the hearing. The Planning Commission then shall either approve with conditions, or deny the application. Depending on what that decision is, the applicant would have the right to appeal that decision to City Council. However, if there was also a legal protest, City Council could make the final decision. Legal protest would be that a signed acknowledged petition by owners of 25% or more of land within 185 feet would include that. This is really similar to the process that we use for home business permits. So I do want to reiterate that Planning Commission by code would be the ones making the decision on this, and then applicants or property owners could essentially appeal that to the council level. Some other changes that we've included with this, not necessarily related to the short-term rental use. First of all, on our bed and breakfast definitions, we're removing the limit on the number of rooms offered. Currently, our definition of a bed and breakfast limits those uses to 6 or fewer rooms. we were removing that cap. Since it's a special use permit, I think from the staff standpoint, we feel that that's something that can be reviewed in the process. And if ultimately council feels that more than 6 rooms are appropriate, that can be approved as part of that process. We removed the limit on meals that are offered, meaning that currently our definition states that only breakfast may be offered in a bed and breakfast. We say that any meal can be offered, not just breakfast. And then they would change from permitted uses to conditional uses in commercial districts. That more or less means that there's just a set of conditions that they'll have to meet if they offer a bed and breakfast in a commercial district. The other change that we made was with hotels. We're adding that rooms may be rented no more than 30 consecutive days to the hotel definition. That has a lot to do with the hotel motel ordinance that was passed recently, and we're just trying to match that so we have some consistency. We run into just a few issues, minor issues on that, so adding this is definitely appropriate. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to council and look to see if we're on the right track here and if there's any direction on possibly getting an ordinance moving forward.
Mr. Russo, would you go back to the permitting and licensing? My mind wandered for a second. I just want to be sure that
This
I'm
one?
understanding that if these, every single one of these would need to go through the planning commission and have a public hearing and go to the council. I mean, we could be talking about hundreds.
Yeah, and again, if they would only go to council. So like a home business permit, commission is the final say on these unless the applicant wants to appeal the decision to council, or if there's a legal protest by neighbors, then it would come to council. Otherwise, it would just stay at the commission level.
Well, I mean, in consideration that, one, this is still a fairly new industry, and we don't have, I mean, nobody really has any process in place at this point. I mean, that just seems like it could be overwhelming. And I think, I mean, my concern would be, you know, cumbersome for everybody involved, but also, you know, people just simply aren't going to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that we're going to find ourselves in a situation where, you know,
I can
just
give you
aren't
some.
going to do it until it comes a time where somebody, you know, they say, either because they don't know they have, I mean, for all the reasons that people don't, you know, get licenses for all kinds of things in the city. But that does seem like it would be overwhelming.
I can give you some feedback from the staff working group's perspective on this issue. It's something that we did kind of spend a lot of time talking about the process to go through. In the end, I think the concern is, you know, the neighbors out there would not have a say without going through this process, and we're just really trying to create a balance. So bed and breakfasts currently have to go through the special use permit process, which does take it to council. We're trying to strike that balance here and saying, you know, can we create an easier process for them to come through, take, you know, a month off the process by not making it a special use permit, but still give the neighbors the right to be heard via a public hearing of some sort.
Okay.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
To go along with that thought, the purpose isn't, I don't think, to be over cumbersome and overburdensome for sure, but this is a changing industry, and specifically, we're talking a lot about the Airbnbs specifically, and wanting to make it an even playing field as much as possible, number one, to those who are paying their permits and doing their fair share of making sure that the taxes that they collect are collected correctly and passed on, and also providing good and measurable safety precautions to the people who are there. But also, more importantly, this opens up, and probably argue that it's already taken place in an overwhelming measure of Airbnbs in our community, that no one has any idea that they're really there unless you're a neighbor immediately next to them and see the traffics on occasions. So I think this adds a level of protection to the communities and to the neighborhoods that deserve a little bit more of an input. And third, I forgot what point I'm on, but Charlie, thank you for taking the time and meeting with staff and myself and other individuals to really kind of hammer this out and try to smooth the the process along and taking into the concerns from everybody. So this was a lot of time that you put in, so I appreciate your willingness to do it.
Yes, Councilman?
Yeah, Charlie, I want to thank you too. I think for the most part, you've really done it well. I mean, it's very well laid out. I don't know what the cost would be, you know, for an Airbnb if they want to get registered. Obviously, they would have to fill out the application, and I guess it would be inspected to make sure the CO and all that is in place, and they have to document that they have trash service and all that, right?
Yeah.
And it would give the city a handle on really how much of this type of rental is going on in the city. We have no idea right now, to be honest with you. Probably not near as much here as in some other venues, but still, it also gives a measure of safety for anyone that would use those. And I think it gives the city a level of safety knowing that private homes that are being used for this type of business periodically are safe, even for those homeowners. So I think there's a big benefit for the city of Independence. I didn't see any penalty. So if they don't do this, are we going to level any sort of penalty? Is there going to be some sort of fine? I mean, that's one of the things. The other thing that I've mentioned at our HOA summit we had last year, I don't believe any of the HOAs in their covenants and restrictions have any language about Airbnbs, and they have probably no idea if there's any in any of the HOAs. We have at least 35 to 50 HOAs in the city of Independence, which actually themselves could restrict Airbnbs, but none of them have language about it, and that's how new it is. So I think this is a great step in the right direction, and even if we had to maybe amend things or tweak things down the road, it's a great way for neighbors then to know that that's going on in their neighborhood. So safety and awareness and all that. So.
Yes, Councilman.
Good luck.
Yeah, I know.
Whoa.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Yeah.
A question along with the safety that Scott was talking about as well. I guess this is a question to our counselor. With enforcement, with the unique system of Airbnb, we may or may not know that they're out there. Is there any type of enforcement that we can do? Can we sign up? Can we act as if we want to rent an Airbnb and see if those people are actually, if this gets fully implemented, to see if they are actually permitted within the city or anything like that?
Actually, that's what we did at the inception of several bed and breakfasts. We sent out undercover officers to enjoy a night in the facility.
Mm-hmm.
It's the most effective technique for discovering them, is taking them up on their advertising and utilizing their services then as proof that they're in fact doing what they should have complied with whatever regulations to do.
So that is a tool to use?
Yeah.
For sure. Okay. Well, maybe Chief Halsey can figure out some officers that'd like to have a staycation at some point and all that stuff. All right. Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, Councilman.
I don't know how you're going to do this, but this is a great step forward. What I most like is that you're still going with the bed and breakfast and continuing to evolve in it by doing this and keeping that line of communication open with them and being fair. I commend it. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, this takes us to boards and commissions. Madam City Clerk.
Yes, Mayor. Yes, Mayor, and members of the council. In front of you is my boards and commissions report, and we have a couple of vacancies to go over here. The first one on the list is the Tree Commission. I received a recommendation to reappoint David Campbell, so I'm asking direction to add a resolution the next meeting reappointing Mr. Campbell.
Is there there any objection to putting a resolution on for the September 5th, 4th meeting?
No.
Okay, hearing none, go ahead.
All right, next we have the Board of Building and Engineering Appeals. Now, this is one that we've combined with the Contractor Licensing Review Board, so we're trying to get this one, all the terms active and any vacancies filled. So we received a recommendation to reappoint Kenneth Campfield and Joseph Keene, and then appointing Jim Pollard, who's coming over from the Contracting Licensing Review Board.
Okay.
So I'm requesting direction to add a resolution to reappoint Mr. Campfield and Mr. Keene and appoint Mr. Pollard.
Is there any objection to adding this resolution? Hearing none, go ahead.
All right, next is our Mayor's Advisory Commission on the Visual Arts. A recommendation was received to reappoint Monica Kettenhoffen and Katie Gall to the commission. Asking direction for resolution.
Is there any objection to this resolution? Okay.
I'll
Go
get us
ahead.
to the next meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. City Manager, anything else this evening?
Nothing tonight, thank you.
You're adjourned.